Hello everybody, my name is Terry Sveine and I'm here in front of the Brown County Historic Society, and today we're going to do a walking tour of sites related to the U.S.-Dakota War in downtown New Ulm. The one challenge with this type of tour is we're going to walk about an 8-block rectangle, but the sites we're seeing are not in chronological order, and I'll be telling the story in chronological order, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit. But it's better than running here and 4 blocks over there and 3 blocks back, so I know that you can manage that. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is some background about the war. You won't know much about it. It won't mean as much if you don't know the background. So, the U.S. is steadily expanding westward in the mid-1800s, and Minnesota becomes a territory in 1849. Territoryship is a stepping stone to statehood, and you need 2 major things for that to happen. One is the federal government has to set the boundaries of the new state based on input from local people. You don't want to be so big that you overwhelm everybody around you. You don't want to be so small you're insignificant. So the federal government works on the boundaries for it. But the big thing that drove the war is that you need 60,000 citizens before you can succeed from a territory to a state. So the leaders of early Minnesota look around and it's like, well, there's people living here already. Where are we going to find 60,000 people? The Ojibwe or Chippewa lived in the northern part of Minnesota, and the Sioux or Dakota lived in the southern part. Minnesota is about 400 miles from Iowa border to Canada border. So they realize the state is quite different. The northern part of the state is it's much colder. I used to live up in the Iron Range, and I can tell you it's much colder up there. The soil is pretty poor, not much for agriculture there. The pine forest, the eventual mining. And so the southern part of the state, with the trees on the eastern part, but mainly the prairie from the central and the west, is where the state was going to develop. That would attract people to settle. And so they realized we've got to deal with the existing people. So 2 treaties were signed in 1851 up in Mendota near the Twin City Airport today, and then in Traverse des Sioux over by modern-day St. Peter. So the reservation runs, as you can see, about 8 miles west of New Ulm. It goes down to Little Cottonwood River and up, about 10 miles either side of the Minnesota River. Now the Dakota, there were 4 bands of Dakota, and 2 were administered from the Lower Sioux Reservation, based by modern-day Redwood Falls, about here on the map. And the other 2 bands of the Dakota of the Upper Sioux Agency, administered out of modern-day Granite Falls, rather. Well, what that did is open up the land. The Dakota, for giving up their land, for selling their land, and I would point out forcibly selling their land, were given promises for many things. On the reservations, they were going to have farmers teaching them how to farm. They were going to have carpenters helping to build buildings and infrastructure. There was money allotted for food and plows and supplies to get started. The U.S. goal had always been, when dealing with the native people, to try and get them to live like the whites. It would be easier to blend together. Now, if you're a Dakota, that's probably not what you want, but that's what the governmental view was. So they were promised, they sold the land for several $1 million, I don't remember the total, but they were promised yearly annuities. They weren't given that money in a lump sum. It was held in the banks by the federal government, and then the interest was paid annually to them for 50 years. And that money was promised to enable them to live a moderate life. Well, we become a state in 1858, and treaties are signed to get rid of the north half of the reservation. And to my knowledge, not a single penny found its way to a Dakota person. There's a thing called the Indian system. It existed throughout our country's history, and it was very abusive to the native people. It was a way for a lot of people to steal a lot of the Indians' money, and that was the case here. So an incident happens in August of 1862 in a little settlement called Acton, about 40 miles north of here. 4 young Dakota men are off the reservation. We hear 2 stories, either hunting or chasing their enemy, the Ojibwe. Well, the long and short of it is they meet some farmers in the area by Acton. Things get out of hand, and 5 white people are killed. The 4 Dakota men steal the horses from the farms of the people they killed, ride back to the Lower Sioux Agency, and they tell their leaders. And the leaders are, oh my God, trouble's coming to us. This is not going to go unpunished by the federal government or the state government. And so they have a big meeting that night where everybody's putting in their voice. And what it amounted to is there was enough clamor to go to war. The Dakota realized the Civil War is on. So there's hardly a professional military man in the state of Minnesota. And so this is their one chance. Again, the leaders are going, trouble's coming to us, and they're probably going to punish all of us, not you 4 knuckleheads who did this. And so, again, the day was carried to go to war. And so there ended up being 7 battles in a 6-week period along the Minnesota River Valley. And so New Ulm is attacked twice, on the 19th of August and again the 23rd, 24th. So the first attack of the war is at the Lower Sioux Agency. It's about, on this map, if we can see, about up here where my hand is. And about 30 white people died. There were several white people living on the reservation as administrators. There were 4 or 5 trading posts that had white staff people living there. So about 30 are killed. The Dakota are spreading out all over. It was not, in the Dakota world, every man is his own leader. You don't have to follow a general like you do in a traditional European-based army. And so the next big attack was at Milford. Again, if you can see the reservation borderline here, Milford is a settlement of several farmers. It wasn't a town per se, but several farmers living just over the border. And 53 white people are killed. They were going about their day. It had always been called the Milford Massacre. I don't want to get into my opinion of things, but it's pretty difficult to not call it that. They were doing nothing, they did nothing wrong. They were going about their day, having lunch, harvesting crops, doing laundry. And so some of the people, not everybody from Milford died, so some of them survivors, they run into New Ulm and they're telling people, oh my God, the Indians are going crazy on the prairie, you've got to do something. And people in New Ulm, a lot of people didn't believe them. They said, no, they were just in here trading at my store yesterday. They can't be fighting. What's that about? Well, finally, enough people coming in with wounds and such convinced the leaders that something had to be done. And so New Ulm is hastily barricaded from roughly Center Street to 3rd North, a 3-block area. Minnesota Street is the downtown street. And then to the alleyway on either side, making a little 3-block island of defense. And so we're going to go around the other side of this plaque and look at a wonderful drawing. So this painting is by a man named Mike Eischen. He's from Comfrey, about 30 miles west of New Ulm. He did this in 2004. It is, to my mind, the most detailed thing we have to envision what New Ulm looked like at the time, both as a pioneering city and a city under attack. So our point of reference is, this is Minnesota Street, the downtown street still today. And you see how the town is barricaded with wagons and lumber. You make a little island of defense. Today, where we are, the Historic Society would be on this corner location. This is Broadway, today the main drag, then just a simple street. And so within this area, there end up being 2,000 people. It's pretty confined. We'll talk more about that as we go on. But that was the defensive area in New Ulm. It shows how the buildings are being burned. We'll talk about that further as well. The Robecki Mill we'll mention. Looking all the way down to the Minnesota River, you see how the ferry was burned. Some of the buildings, lumber mills and such down along the river. But one thing I like to show people too, so this is the whole valley heading northwest would be your viewpoint. There's hardly any trees. And that's one of the factors that if the pioneers could come back in time and look at New Ulm, they'd be surprised at how big it is. And they'd also be surprised at all the trees around here. This was the prairie, there were hardly any trees. Prairie fires would come through regularly and burn the saplings. You would have some trees along the river, in the ravines and such, but it's a pretty sparse open prairie. So this is a great piece of work here. If you get the chance, I always encourage people to come and do a live walking tour with myself or any of the other guides from the museum, and really spend some time looking at this. Once you learn the story, it will help you envision it so much more. And now we're going to go have a peek at the Robecki Mill. So I want to talk about the Robecki Mill. Again, our location would be here, going up 1 block to State Street. The Robecki Mill was a 70-foot tall wooden grain mill. It ground wheat and other grains into flour. So during the Second Battle of New Ulm on the 23rd and 4th of August, we had defenders come over from St. Peter, Mankato, and Le Sueur. And a group of defenders called themselves the Le Sueur Tigers. They were holed up in the mill. And it served as a great defensive piece. It kept the Indians back from coming in the western part of town. So from a military point of view, it was great. They're up here, they can shoot down. It was a great place to be. But about 10 p.m. on the 23rd of August, during the second battle, they realized that they're going to run out of ammunition. And so they don't want to leave that to the enemy. So they abandoned it, but started on fire. And stories tell you that about 10 o'clock with the Robecki Mill burning, it lit up the night like midday. And think of it, it's 70 feet of dry wood covered in grain dust with sacks of milled grain all around them. It would have burned like crazy. So the Robecki Mill served a definite defensive point, and then they burned it to take it away from the enemy. All right, we're on the site of the Jacob Castor Bakery. Jacob Castor was an early settler of New Ulm and had a bakery on this site. You'll notice, if you have your orientation right, that we are outside the barricaded area. And during the Second Battle of New Ulm, Jacob is noticing that his people, his fellows, are getting pretty hungry. They haven't had much to eat. So he's thinking, I'm going to go to my bakery, I'll gather up bunches of bread and such and bring it back to them. So he comes out of the barricades and comes over here, loads up, whether in baskets or a towel, we don't know. But he decides, for reasons unsure, he puts over either a big blanket or a buffalo skin rug over himself as he goes back to the barricades. The sad part is some of the defenders didn't know what was going on, thought he was an attacker, and shot and killed him. Now, one of the people on my tour said, so the lesson is don't do good deeds? No, I don't think that's the lesson. The lesson might be, if you're going to do something, let other people know what you're doing. But what a sad story for Jacob Castor. All right, so here we are today in front of the Minnesota Music Hall of Fame on First North and Broadway. And I like to use this plaque, was installed in 1962, to give a feel for things. So it shows the downtown again, the barricaded line, enclosing all the defenders down here. Jacob Castor's bakery would have been there. The Robecki Mill would have been on this location here. But what I talk about here is the armaments. Bob Burgess is a former director of the museum. And he said the Indians, that to his determination, the Indians, some had bow and arrow, but the most had rifles. And rifles that could accurately shoot a New Ulm block. A New Ulm block is 450 feet. Now, a bullet isn't going to go 450 feet and fall off, obviously. It would have what's called overshoot capabilities. And so the Indians were up on State Street. State Street is 1 block up here, but it rises about 20 feet up from where we are now. And so the Indians would be up on a hill shooting down. That, from a military point of view, is a good way to have things. You can shoot into the barricaded area. To the point of the Indians' rifles, they had been using rifles for at least 20, if not longer, years before 1862. They would have gotten them from fur traders, and then once the reservation was established, there were trading posts on there. They would buy rifles. They would use the rifles for hunting game. Deer and rabbits and things of that nature. So they were well used, knew how to use a rifle. I think there's a myth that they were all on horsebacks with bows and arrows like in the Hollywood movies, and that's not really true here. So the terrain plays a role, with the Indians being able to be up a little higher, as well as the fact that the Indians had good weaponry, better than the defenders. During the first battle, it's been estimated, if I remember my numbers right, something like there were less than 50 guns between all of the people. New Ulm, by the way, had a population of about 900 people at the first battle. With about only 50 guns, that's not a very good defensive measure. You're trying to defend 3 blocks from all sides with 50 guns. It was not good. The first battle started on the 19th, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It went on for 3 hours. And then a rainstorm came up and ended the fighting. Now, Jacob Nix, who we'll talk about later, was the leader of the first battle. In his memoirs, he says, the thunderstorms came up and scared the Indians. Well, that's just not true. The Indians have been living on the prairies for hundreds of years. They're well used to a thunderstorm. So the fact is, the rains came up and got everybody's ammunition wet, and so they couldn't shoot. So they retreated away. So we're going to go to the middle of the next block and talk about the Forster House. So now we're in front of the Forster building, and Frederick Forster was one of the early settlers, and he had this as his home, his pottery business, as well as the post office. It's a brick building. It's not within the barricaded areas though, but it's a brick building that served a similar purpose to the Robecki Mill. That is, it was outside the barricades, but it kept the Indians away from the western perimeter. And so people would have gotten into this building, defenders that is, and on the back side of it, popped out the windows, put wooden slats where they could to protect themselves from incoming gunfire, had put mattresses up against windows, and used it as a defensive place. It worked very well. There are said to be bullet scars on the north side of this building. Unfortunately, they're covered and we can't get in there to see it now, but it speaks to its role as a defensive place. But I also like this building. It talks about how we've changed the perception and interpretation of the war. So after the fighting went on, it was called for the longest time the Indian Massacre. Well, it's not a very pleasant term. It puts all of the blame on one people. That's not all fair. And so the next interpretive panel is this one over here, which refers to it as the Uprising. For probably a good 100+ years, this battle was called the Sioux Uprising. That's what it was when I was a boy. And well, think of what the uprising means. It means that some people were sitting in a corner, got sick of something, and raised a ruckus. And that's not really true. The Dakota were treated poorly, pushed in a corner, had virtually everything about their life and culture changed, and when they finally tried to do something about it, they were perceived as the bad guys. So around the year 2000, give or take, maybe 95 or whatever it was, led by the Minnesota Historic Society, the name changed. The war was no longer a massacre, it was no longer an uprising, but it became known as the Dakota Conflict. Well, something good is in there. First of all, they're calling it the Dakota, which is the term the people prefer to use for themselves. That's a plus. But conflict, to my mind, was never really adequate. If me and my neighbor don't get along, we put a fence up, and that's a bit of a conflict. This is the largest Indian-white battles in the history of the United States. It was a little more than a conflict. Hundreds of people died. So about 2005 or so, the terms change again, and it becomes, here we have Dakota conflict again. It becomes the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. And that, in my mind, is a very accurate description. It delineates both the parties involved, the fact that it was indeed a war, not a conflict, and the year that it happened, 1862. So history changes, and the way you use terms does have some importance. You can get a little too involved in political correctness, but I think it's both respectful and accurate. So here we are at the Jacob Nix Platz. I used to be the tourism manager for the Chamber of Commerce, and there's a walking tour brochure we would give out to interested visitors. And I remember the first time it happened many times, but the first one I wasn't prepared for it. And that is, a man came back from the tour, he said, "Oh, I really learned a lot, this is great. I was particularly impressed with Mr. Platz's story." And I thought, Mr. Platz, you know, I kind of know this story fairly well. I can't think of a Mr. Platz. I said, "Tell me where it is." He said, "Well, it's kitty corner from your armory." Oh, and then it dawned on me. Kitty corner from the armory, the Jacob Nix Platz. Platz is not his last name. It's a German word that means place or plaza. So this is the Jacob Nix Plaza, not Platz. So the reason I talk about Jacob, this location had nothing to do with him, but it's an important story in the defensive parts of New Ulm. Jacob Nix was one of many people called the 48ers. In 1848, there were 50-some revolutions across Western Europe to try and overthrow the nobility, to install democratic forms of government. And those people that were fighting against the governments needed to learn military skills. And Jacob Nix was one of them in Germany, who learned to be a military leader. And I always told people, if today there was an attack on New Ulm, I would be the last guy you'd want. I don't know anything about how to assemble a town and organize defenses, things of that nature. But Jacob Nix and many others did know how. They were 48ers, people who came in 1848. So I think one of the keys to New Ulm's defensive survival was the fact that they knew how to do it. When word got to New Ulm from Milford that the town was likely to be attacked next, Jacob Nix was elected the leader and immediately set about organizing the defenses, which proved to be the saving grace of New Ulm. All right, so here we are in a nondescript location, folks. This is behind the New Ulm Funeral Home. I use it to get us off of Broadway into some shade because these tours are generally done in the middle of summer, early in the afternoon. It gets people out of the sun, and it also is quieter. But there is some relevance to where we are, and that is back here would have been the barricades. So right through the alley here, if you can imagine, lumber, timber, furniture, overturned wagons, cordwood, really anything to stop bullets and men. And so it was lined up from 3rd North here, 3 blocks to the right, and that was the barricades. But I also like to talk about what it was like for the average person to be inside the barricades. Now, this is a tour about New Ulm's experience during the U.S.-Dakota War. This is not intended to be comprehensive and neutral, but this is what the New Ulm people experienced. So New Ulm had a population of about 900 people at the time, but with relief defenders primarily from the Mankato area, St. Peter and Le Sueur, in addition to all of the refugees, hundreds of refugees that came from the western part of the state. New Ulm is the furthest west community in southern Minnesota, so we were the first point refugees came as their area was attacked. And so we had a population of over 2,000 people. Now, I always tell my audience, I'm going to treat you as adults, and I'm going to talk about something that isn't pleasant, but I think it needs to be mentioned. New Ulm in a 3-block confine was not intended to have the sanitation needs for 2,000 people. There were outhouses behind the buildings, but 2,000 people, no, it was overwhelmed. I've never found a source that talks about whether there were ad hoc latrines made with trenches dug and sheets around them, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was true. Just think of the need versus the facilities. So that wouldn't have also been a pleasant place to be. Remember, it's August in southern Minnesota. It's generally the hottest time of the year. We do have report that at least 3 days, the 19th, I believe, 20th and 21st, had rain, which would have cooled it off. The 23rd, however, the start of the second battle, was said to be exceedingly hot. So people are not dressed like I am with a Hawaiian shirt and shorts and no socks. The men would have had either heavy boots or heavy shoes with big thick socks, long pants, generally a long sleeve shirt. They may have rolled the sleeves up, but it wasn't what I'm wearing. They would have had a vest, possibly an undershirt. They were hot just standing in the sun. Women would have worn hoop skirts if it was something formal, but more typically layers of skirting, petticoats and all the underclothing that they had buckled up to their neck. So just the way people dressed in a hot climate was not conducive to anything. Then you put the panic factor in it, the young babies crying and screaming, not knowing what's going on, and then animals. We will talk about that shortly, but there were roughly 200 plus animals on the streets downtown, also not contributing to a sanitary situation very well. So there were not screens, metal screens like we all have on our houses now. They were not invented. And so you would either hang lacy curtains or cloth over the windows if you wanted, but when you do that, you stop any breeze. So it was hot, it was dirty, it was unsanitary, constant need for water. There were pumps, well pumps behind some of the business buildings downtown. Most of the businesses would have had their owner living above on the second floor of the building. So there were pumps, but we don't know where they were nor how many. But to get enough water for 2,000 people had to be a constant struggle. There were people probably continually pumping those pumps. All of the filth, both animal and human related, would have done nothing but attract vermin. I've talked to veterinarians who were telling me about what it's like in confined animal spaces, and one man said there were probably literally millions of flies downtown attracted by all of it. You'd have mosquitoes. You'd have all of the smells attract vermin, mice and rats and all of that type of thing. So it was a horribly unpleasant place to be. Then you factor in the fact that I would venture to say nobody got an 8 hours night of sleep for a good week. They're crammed together in whatever available buildings there are, in basements. Nobody's wearing deodorant either, by the way. Again, I don't want to be off color, but that's the reality of the situation. So this was not a pleasant place to be. Then, of course, the terror. Everything I have is on its line here. I'm being attacked. What's going on? And so the questions and the terror, this had to be a horrible place to be. All right, so here we are on 3rd North and Minnesota Street. Minnesota is the downtown street. And so right in front of us would have been the barricades. Again, wagons turned, lumber, furniture, whatever can stop men and bullets. And so after New Ulm's first battle on the 19th, the Indians retreated upriver and gathered at Fort Ridgely. There were 2 battles at Fort Ridgely on the 20th and 22nd of August, and the defenders in New Ulm could hear the cannons up there. There were a few cannons at Fort Ridgely. The sound echoed down the valley, and they could hear that. And so they thought, gosh, we don't have a cannon, but could we mimic a cannon? And so they got a wagon. And then August Keisling, there's 2 Keisling brothers, Frederick and August, so you have to kind of keep them separate. August Keisling has a blacksmith shop on the end of the street here, and he goes back and gets 2 anvils. And if you will think of what an anvil looks like, it's got usually that pointed end, there's a rounded other end. There's often a hole in the middle for you could put a heated rod in and bend it in that hole. And so they filled the holes with gunpowder. They secured a stovepipe to look like a cannon barrel, and August Keisling lit the explosives on fire, and then the smoke they kind of forced to go out the stovepipe, so it was mimicking a cannon. It sounds funny to us, but interviews with Indians after the fact said they thought New Ulm had a cannon because of that. The explosion was so strong that August Keisling had hearing problems. So I want to talk about defensive sort of things, and we'll look up to State Street and then down to German Street. And then, if we can, down the length of Minnesota Street as well. So from this point to 3 blocks as the camera is looking was the defended area of New Ulm. So I have always wondered about the defending part. So we know we were up at State Street, you're shooting down about 20 feet. That, from a military point of view, is a good thing to have. Shooting up, however, from German Street, more difficult. If you're down and shooting up, odds are good you'll overshoot your target. So in defending New Ulm, the Indians would have surrounded the town. The first battle, it's suspected about 100 Dakota had essentially surrounded the barricaded area. The second battle, estimated to be over 600 Dakota people, fully, literally surrounding the town. And those down in German Street have the disadvantage of shooting up at their target here on Minnesota Street, but they had grasses. That part of town wasn't developed. There were tall prairie grasses. Prairie grasses could be 2, 4, 6, 8 feet high. And many first-hand reports will talk about they knew the Dakota were down there because they could see the grasses moving, but they couldn't see them. The grasses were tall enough to hide the warriors. And so those down there had a tougher time of it. However, downtown was not like it looks now. That is, with 2-story brick buildings sharing a common wall. Other than one building we'll see, they were all freestanding wooden structures, which meant the Indians could shoot between them. So I've always wondered, from a personal point of view, my great-great-grandfather Peter Schmitz who farmed between Essig and Sleepy Eye. I have first-hand accounts of him and his family fleeing into New Ulm on with two oxen on a wagon. And I always wondered, what did he do with his oxen? I've since done some work to tell me that most farmers had 160 acres, cost them $200. By the same token, 2 good ox, 2 good horse were also worth $200. So your animals were as precious as your land. If you don't have your oxen, you're not a farmer. And I'm thinking, what could my great-grandpa have done with his oxen? He wouldn't have tied them up out here somewhere. The Indians would have either stolen it or killed it. And so I've always figured he had to put it on Minnesota Street. And doing some work at the Brown County Historic Society, I finally found, I read all the 100+ first-hand accounts of people who lived through the uprising. And finally, a man named Mr. Meyer said, the horses and oxen were kept in enclosures within the barricades on Minnesota Street. Aha, the proof I needed. And so, Minnesota Street, imagine if you will, covered with, I've done some estimations on numbers, of perhaps 200+ animals, horses and oxen, scattered along the next 3 blocks. The sound had to be incredible, especially you put a little fighting in there, the panic. I've spoken with a man named Jim Jensen, he's a master horseman, and Jim said horses, as intelligent as they are also far more sensitive to things. And he said they would have been freaked out of their mind. They would have been nervous wrecks with all the noise and carrying on, the fighting. The Indians had shot several oxen and horses by the time the war's over, and the horses would have just gone crazy over this. So what a scene of pandemonium down here. I have suspected when Mr. Meyer talks about enclosures within the barricades that probably the refugees' wagons were used to make a little corral on each of the 3 blocks to kind of hold the horses and oxen in. It's been said that your chance of danger was as great being on the lines shot at as it was with animals running around you. So what a crazy scene of pandemonium in downtown New Ulm. So here we are at the Frederick Keisling house. Mr. Keisling built his house in 1861. Little did he know a year later it would be in the middle of the fighting. His house is a little unusual, but it's very typical of what houses look like, but its location is unusual. Normally he would have had the house at the front of the lot instead of at the back. I don't know why he chose to put it in the back, but nevertheless his front yard was a giant garden. Most people would have the house in front and the giant garden in back. But it played a role, his decision to put his house on the backside played a role because he is near the barricades in the alley. And the thinking was if the Indians could break through the barricades and get into his house, now they're in the middle of the defenders. They could really cause destruction. So the Keisling house was filled with straw bales, and people were, as soon as the Indians got it, they were ready to light the straw in the house on fire. Luckily, they never had to do it. It is one of 7 structures still left in New Ulm from before the fighting. I want to stress that doesn't mean that all of the other structures were destroyed in the war. Subsequent fires, real estate development, tear this building down, put up a new one, that sort of thing played their role. But that is what a lot of New Ulm looked like, a 2-story wood frame house. I also use this point to tell people about what downtown looked like. And so instead of a freestanding 2-story wooden house, you have now common walls, brick buildings. If there was fighting going on now, look at that across the street. That would be a perfect wall of defense. Well, that wasn't the case. With those freestanding wooden buildings, every time you went between them, it was free game. Anybody could be shooting at you. So here we are at what is today called the Grand Hotel, was then called the Union Hotel. Mr. Philip Gross built this in the late 1850s, named it, well, first it was the Minnesota House, then named it the Union Hotel. Union being a reflection of the Civil War. He was pro-Union against the Confederacy. This is what his house would have, or his hotel would have looked like. This was used, now this building is not the same. It's on the exact same site as his wooden Minnesota house, but it was rebuilt after a fire in brick and much taller as well. But it was used as a hospital. It was one of 2 places used as a hospital. And I've had people on the tour say things like, well, wow, hotel is a hospital, that doesn't make sense. And I'm thinking, in lieu of a hospital, it's the most sensible place to be. They've got beds, They got sheets and pillows and blankets. They've got linens to tear up into bandages. It was the perfect place to be. Now think of the context of this. So between the two battles of New Ulm, roughly 32 people were killed and 60 wounded. So we had about 100 people to take care of. Charles Weschke is the doctor. He's the only doctor in town initially. After the first battle, we got relief. We got James Ayers and Otis Ayers and James McMahon from Mankato, Asa Daniels from St. Peter, and William Mayo from Le Sueur come and help. So we then, during the second battle, had 5 doctors in town, which we needed to take care of that many people. But think of what would have happened. Right on the street behind us is full of animals. Again, roughly 200 animals on the streets here, with all of their noises and smells and flies galore. This, while it was the most practical place for a hospital, had some disadvantages because of its location. Think of, again, no screen windows, all the many flies buzzing in with the operations and removing splinters, removing bullets, and all of the things that went on in here as a hospital. This had to be, and the noises. Think of the crying out of people in pain. Dr. Weschke and his friends were not prepared to handle that many people in this short a time, so their supplies were very limited. So also this location played a role in the people who died. That is, I've always said if I was down here and my wife died, I would not take her out to the cemetery, which is then, as it is now, about 1.5 miles away from here. Because I don't know what's at the end of the street after the barricades. Are there 100, 200, 300 Indians waiting for me? I don't know that. So, and that was the case with the others. So people temporarily buried the dead. And right in front of us on the street, there were several people buried. How they were able to keep the animals from desecrating that, I don't know. But the rest of that story is that after the war and New Ulm was evacuated, slowly people came back and tried to rebuild their town. Well, about November, just as the New Ulmites are digging up their dead comrades, loved ones, and family, a wagon train, many wagons long, carrying 303 Dakota Indians who were said to be guilty and were being transported from upriver to Mankato, are passing through New Ulm. They're down at the Payne Garden Street area, but the New Ulmites who are down here digging up their loved ones, it's November, their bodies have rigor mortis, it's not so smelly and hot. At a very same horrible timing situation, this caravan of Indians comes through, and the New Ulm people attacked it with rocks and all. There were guards keeping them from getting too close, but I believe 2 Dakota men died from being hit in the head with rocks from New Ulmites. So a sad story all around, and a tale of incredibly bad timing. So here we are at the Erd building. Remember I said there were 7 structures left from before the fighting. This is one of them. This building has been changed over the years, but it was Frank Erd's general store. It's the only brick building within the barricades. And so a 2-story general store. It's been stuccoed over, it's got a 3rd story added to it, but this underneath this is still an original building. So the Erd building has got a crazy history. It was, during my upbringing, it was a restaurant called Eibner's. Named Mary Schmitz Ryan. And her story is, with this being the only brick building in the barricades, she was 26 years old and pregnant, by the way. She was tasked with getting as many women and children in the basement of this building as she could. The basement, still, until recently, it's been sheetrocked over, but it had still the fieldstone support for the basement. And we've done the measurements, probably 100, maybe a little more people could have been in here. And the people were so afraid, the women were so afraid. The Dakota way of fighting is that all men die. We're not taking prisoners of war. We're not doing anything like that. All men die. And a man could have been considered roughly a 12-year-old boy and upward. The women, therefore, if the Indians took the town, feared that they would be killed, maimed, raped. They didn't know what to think would happen to their children, so they were scared out of their mind. So Mary Schmitz is tasked with getting them, as many as she can, down there with a keg of gunpowder, with the communal agreement that if the Indians take the town rather than the women get captured and whatnot, she would light the gunpowder keg and blow themselves up or commit mass suicide. So here we are at the site of the Dakota Hotel, as I knew it, the Dakota House as it was in 1862, built by Adolph Sider, as you see here, and his wife Helena Erd Sider. She was sister to the Erd building across the street. And so this was also used as a hotel. It also kept many of the people, the women and children, in here. When the men came from all around the area, the refugees coming in and the defenders, they were all assigned to be in different militias. And they were on the lines continuously. It's often said that they would sleep against the barricades if there was nothing going on. And so the Dakota House was a big part of downtown. It stayed into effect till, I believe, 1971, yes. I remember when it was torn down. It was a sad story because it played such a role in our town's history. After the evacuation of New Ulm, after the fighting is over, Mr. Sider came back fairly quickly. He went to Mankato with the rest of them, but he came back about within a week. And he was saddened to see that by that time, New Ulm is empty, but a troop of U.S. soldiers had been told to occupy it. And they had destroyed his hotel. They had eaten his food and drank his drinks, destroyed his china, dirtied and filthied up all of his bedding and everything. He made a claim for several $1,000s and he didn't hardly get any of it paid. Too bad. But he just thought the irony of going through the whole war and the biggest damage to it comes from people afterwards on his side, supposedly. So this brick set of sculptures attached to a building called Lolas Lark really is not part of the uprising story, but I like it because by just good happenstance, it shows what life was like coexisting between the pioneers and the Dakota Indians. And it's difficult to see it all. This is part of a restaurant and there's a patio here, but I always tell people to come and spend some time on this. It's made out of bricks. It's really clever sculpting. I don't know how you do that all, with all the dimensions and such. But I just think it's worth having a peek at. So we're at the corner of Center Street in Minnesota. The barricades would have been not literally up to the edge of the sidewalk here, but about 100 feet in. But this was the site of a famous place called Flandreau's Charge. What had happened is the Dakota had gotten into August Keisling, remember him from Anvil fame, August Keisling's blacksmith shop and home, which would have been right on the corner here, obviously a different building, but that location. So they are right across the street from the defenders, again with guns that can accurately shoot a block. At the same time as that happens, some of Charles Flandreau, by the way, was elected to be the leader of New Ulm's defenses when he came over from St. Peter on the 20th of August. And one of his lieutenants come up to him and said, "Colonel Flandreau, at this rate of fire, we've only got enough ammunition for about an hour, and the Dakota are across the street." So Flandreau says, "We don't have much choice." So he leads about 40 to 50 men over the barricades to drive the Dakota out of that location. Once they've done that, they realize that all the buildings around it could serve as equal homes, defenses for the enemy. So he has his own people light the buildings on fire, burn them to the ground. I wonder how many wives grabbed their husband's arm tightly and said something like, "But you promised me life would be better in America, and now we're watching our own people burn down everything we own." Marital discord, maybe, huh? So the fighting starts on about 10 o'clock on the 23rd of August, goes almost literally 24 hours until Sunday the 24th. And they have noticed that there is no more shots being fired at them. They've got a man on top of the Erd building with a telescope, and he cannot see any Dakota. He sees some cattle being driven upriver, probably with the Indians, but he really doesn't see any threat. So Charles Flandreau makes the decision that we've got to now evacuate the town. So the 24th, Sunday, was considered a day of rest. People came out of the basements they had been hiding in and were able to get some fresh air and did what they could to just get some sleep. And the morning of the 25th, exactly 153 wagons are loaded with the gear of 2,000 people. I shouldn't say the gear, but with the old folks, the wounded, and the women and children. They're pulled by oxen and the surviving oxen and horses. They're going to evacuate 30 miles to Mankato. Well, there was a contingent in New Ulm, including Jacob Nix, who said, no, Colonel Flandreau, no, we don't know what's out on the prairie. There was always a great fear that the Winnebago Indians, who had been displaced through Wisconsin and Iowa and central Minnesota, had been recently put on a reservation south of Mankato, that they would join the Dakota and you'd be walking very near their reservation. And so the fear was that they would be, the evacuees would be walking right past them. And the tall grasses, there was a road connecting to Mankato, but surrounded by tall grasses and fields, they just feared the unknown. Reasonably so, I think. But nevertheless, Flanders says, no, we're almost out of ammunition. Well, food and drink have always been a struggle for us, and we're about out of both of those. We're going to die of dysentery with all the human and animal filth around here. We've got to get out of here. And so they load the wagons on the 25th, and off they go 30 miles to Mankato. Now think of who's doing this. This is people who, I'm telling you, did not sleep a good night for the last week, who are underfed, underwatered, they're just shot, and yet they managed to make it. But fear was their driver. They had to make it, or else they're trapped out on the prairie in the great unknown. So the end of the story is the evacuees go to Mankato. Some stay there for a week, some a couple months. They have nothing. Their homes and farms have been destroyed. They don't know what to do. Some go on to St. Peter. St. Peter and Mankato don't really ever get the fame they deserve for being refugee towns for the New Ulm people. But nevertheless, some people leave Minnesota never to come back. Some people leave New Ulm never to come back. But little by little, they did come back and rebuilt the town. This is a huge event. This is clearly the biggest event in New Ulm's history. Aside from being totally devastated, I don't know what could be worse. It's estimated about 80% of all the buildings were destroyed. That's what can be worse than that. So by some measurements, by numbers of people killed, about 650 whites, about 150 Dakota. This is the largest Indian-white battles in American history. It's the largest attack on a town by Indians in American history. The sad end of the story is there's two battles upriver in a place called Birch Coulee and then Wood Lake. That ends about, I believe, the 22nd of September. Then the Dakota that have not fled are gathered up. The women, children, and old men are sent across the land to Fort Snelling. A stockade is built for them. They're kept there all winter. Many die of different diseases there, respiratory diseases primarily. And then the Dakota men who are captured are put on trial, sham trials that last as little as 3, 4, 5 minutes in a language the defendant doesn't speak. Things would be like, did you carry a gun in New Ulm? Yes, I did. Oh, you're guilty. Well, they're not guilty. They were being a soldier defending their way of life, but they were deemed to be guilty. Bishop Whipple, who was ministering to the Dakota up on their reservation, says this is crazy, and he goes to Washington in the middle of the Civil War. He goes to Washington D.C. and talks to President Lincoln. He said there's a travesty on the prairie in Minnesota, and he told of all the nearly 400 guys who are convicted of being guilty simply for being soldiers. And Lincoln says, well, I'm not going to have that many killed. But he said, you know, the movement is to kill all of the Indians, and we can't have that. So we need some form of justice to satisfy both sides as best as we can. So he had his best judicial men look into the cases, the transcripts, and for people doing out-and-out murder, torture, and rape. And 38 men were convicted guilty and hung in Mankato on the 26th of December, downtown Mankato. It's the largest mass execution in American history. So by many standards, this is the biggest deal that will ever happen in southern Minnesota, if not all of the state of Minnesota. And I always end this and tell people, I'm 65 years old. I grew up in New Ulm, had ancestors who fought in the war, and we were never taught about it. How can that be? When I was at the chamber and people would ask about it, I said it's like a modern young person in Berlin, Germany, finding out by accident that 2 of the world wars ended in their backyard and no one ever told them about it. Well, obviously the scale is different, but I think the result is the same. I would end by saying that for the last at least 35 years, the New Ulm students have been taught. They get a walking tour in 3rd grade of kind of the same route we did, and in 6th grade they get a city tour, and this is emphasized too. So folks, I hope you've learned something. It's certainly a big story to learn about. There's numerous books on it. If I was to recommend one particular book, I think it's the best overview and introduction. It's a book called The U.S.-Dakota War by Kenneth Carley. Thank you. So we'll end our tour back where we started, on the front steps of the Brown County Historic Society. We should talk about what happened to the Dakota people. So after the group is gathered, the women, old men, and children are gathered at the base of Fort Snelling in a stockade. They're held over the winter. I already said several died. That spring, they are sent down riverboats to just north of St. Louis, where the Missouri River joins the Mississippi. Then they're sent up the Missouri River to some crappy land, and that's the right word for it, in South Dakota, called Crow Creek. It's near modern-day Chamberlain, South Dakota. They are given provisions with, maggoty meat, clothing with holes in it, blankets with holes in it. Horrible, not enough provisions. Several people, hundreds of people died in the next 2-3 years. Finally, the federal government removed them, shut down Crow Creek, and put them in other reservations in the Dakotas and Nebraska. Also, a bounty was placed on their head. So the Dakota are banished from Minnesota. If anybody shot and killed one, they could bring in the scalp and be paid a bounty. There were different price ranges, but about $75. And to my knowledge, about 3 or 4 people actually claimed the bounty. To me, for something that happened 150 some years ago, to get paid for killing somebody seems pretty barbaric. So times have changed for the better, obviously. Now, the Dakota men that were not hung, about 280 or so, are sent down to a military prison in Davenport, Iowa, where they were kept for 3 years, and several died there as well, finally freed. So the story of the Dakota in this whole thing is just the sad story. It's sad for everybody. Nobody won the U.S.-Dakota War. Even if you can say the white side did, well, all of the losses and deaths, I don't know that that's really winning. So a sad story. I hope you will put some more effort into learning more about it, because it's certainly worth your time. Thank you, folks.